Imagine the dead of night, pitch-black waters in the middle of the Indian Ocean. A massive oil tanker, running dark with no transponder, thinks it has slipped through the cracks. Then, without warning, helicopters descend, fast ropes drop, and elite operators seize the vessel in seconds. Not a single shot fired. This isn't a Hollywood thriller. This is the reality of a new, unprecedented global blockade. We are looking at a geopolitical shockwave that is rewriting the rules of global power in real time.
It truly is a paradigm shift. What we are witnessing is the absolute weaponization of maritime supremacy. You have the United States executing a suffocating naval blockade on Iran, effectively cutting off the financial oxygen to Tehran. But the real target, the silent victim in all of this, is sitting halfway across the world, completely paralyzed. And that is China. We're talking about the strangulation of the most important energy corridor on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly. Looking at the sheer volume of reports pouring in from the tactical seizures of Ghost Fleet tankers to the fiery, polarized meltdowns in domestic media and the panicked reactions of global markets, it can feel like chaos. But if we summarize these events, a very clear picture emerges. We have a massive military operation crippling Iran's oil exports, Iran retaliating by seizing whatever commercial ships it can, a deeply fractured domestic response in the West, and a complete realignment of Middle Eastern alliances. What would you surmise is the fundamental bond tying all these chaotic threads together?
The connective tissue here is the brutal, unforgiving reality of geography and logistics. For decades, we bought into the illusion that globalization and digital economies made physical borders and ocean trade routes somewhat secondary. What bonds these events together is the brutal awakening that paper power means absolutely nothing if you cannot physically protect your supply lines. The United States is proving that he who rules the seas still rules the world. Every single thread, the media frenzy, the diplomatic paralysis, the economic shockwave stems from one single reality. America controls the ocean, and therefore, America controls the outcome.
That is a chilling but incredibly accurate way to frame it. It makes me want to dissect this using a more structured lens. Let us run this entire scenario through a SWOT analysis. What are the core strengths and weaknesses at play here, and where do the opportunities and threats lie?
Let us start with the strengths. The most glaring strength is the unmatched capability of the American naval architecture. We are talking about carrier strike groups, overlapping radar coverage, and elite special forces executing surgical interdictions thousands of miles from home. Another massive strength? The American domestic oil industry. With Iranian crude choked off, American ports in Texas and Louisiana are experiencing a historic boom, filling the global supply vacuum at premium prices.
But there have to be weaknesses in this strategy. You cannot just choke off a massive chunk of the global energy supply without some serious blowback.
Precisely. The primary weakness is the lack of a clear diplomatic off-ramp. You can enforce a blockade, but what is the end game? If the demands constantly shift, the adversary has no incentive to negotiate. Furthermore, there's a structural weakness in the global economy. This blockade risks triggering a massive global recession due to oil supply shocks. The longer it lasts, the more the enforcer of the blockade absorbs the economic blowback.
And the opportunities? It seems like some players are quietly making a fortune while the world burns.
Without a doubt, the biggest opportunity here falls right into the lap of Russia. With Iranian oil off the market, Russian crude becomes infinitely more valuable. Moscow is quietly raking in billions in additional revenue without firing a single shot, all while locking China into a deep long-term energy dependency. For the U.S., the opportunity is a total restructuring of Middle Eastern security, essentially forcing Arab nations to definitively align against Iranian proxies.
Which leaves the threats. And I imagine the threats are not just military, but asymmetric.
Absolutely. The immediate threat is desperate retaliation. If a regime feels it has nothing left to lose, you see spikes in asymmetric warfare, cyber attacks, proxy terrorism, or rogue strikes on civilian infrastructure. There is also the threat of domestic fracture. As we have seen in the media reports, The domestic population is fiercely divided, with some factions openly protesting the government's actions while others demand even harsher measures. That internal instability is a massive vulnerability.
That perfectly transitions us into the operational reality. Let us apply the MOST framework to this mission, objectives, strategies, and tactics. What is the actual mission driving this unprecedented show of force?
The overarching mission is the reassertion of absolute global hegemony. It is about proving that the current world order is still underwritten by American military deterrence. Beneath that, the objectives are twofold: permanently dismantle Iran's nuclear and terror funding capabilities, and simultaneously expose China's strategic vulnerability by starving its industrial machine of cheap energy.
So the strategy to achieve those objectives is essentially economic asphyxiation rather than traditional boots-on-the-ground warfare.
Exactly. The strategy is to win the war without fighting a land battle. It is a siege. And the tactics used to execute this strategy are fascinating. We are seeing the deployment of high-altitude drones feeding real-time heat signatures to destroyers, the physical boarding of Shadow Fleet tankers in the dead of night, and the use of cutting-edge technology like laser defense domes to swat retaliatory missiles out of the sky. It is a masterclass in modern, multi-domain tactical execution.
It is almost suffocating to think about. A net so tight that attempting to move through it becomes functionally suicidal. But the fallout of this strategy bleeds far beyond military tactics. Let us pan out and look at the full nature of this combined reality using a pestle analysis. Politically and economically, the landscape is shifting under our feet.
Politically, we're witnessing a bizarre realignment. Traditional allies like the UK are hesitating, paralyzed by their own domestic political fears, while Arab Gulf states are quietly, or sometimes openly, aligning with the blockade to neutralize a mutual regional threat. Economically, it is a massive wealth transfer. China is burning through its strategic reserves and facing skyrocketing procurement costs. Iran is facing absolute financial ruin, and the US and Russia are reaping extraordinary financial windfalls.
And socially, the media landscape seems entirely unhinged. We are seeing extreme polarization, where foreign policy decisions are instantly weaponized for domestic culture wars.
That is the social reality of modern conflict. Wars are no longer just fought on the ocean, they are fought on timelines and news feeds. You have citizens actively rooting against their own governments, deep-seated anxieties about immigration and domestic terrorism boiling over, and a media ecosystem that thrives on maximum outrage. It creates a deeply volatile social fabric.
Let us touch on the technological and legal aspects of the pestle framework. We mentioned laser defenses, but the technology of surveillance seems to be the real star here.
Yes, the technological leap is staggering. The ability to track a ship running dark with falsified transponders in the middle of the ocean requires an integration of satellite coverage, submarine, sonar, and artificial intelligence that was unimaginable a decade ago. Legally, however, we are in the Wild West. We're watching the concept of international law being actively rewritten. When you seize foreign vessels in international waters, you are essentially declaring that international law is whatever the nation with the biggest navy says it is.
Which brings us to the environmental piece. A blockade of this magnitude, with millions of barrels of crude oil sitting in idle, aging tankers or pipelines bursting at the seams because the oil has nowhere to go. The ecological risk is a ticking time bomb.
It is a massive, unspoken vulnerability. One miscalculation, one kinetic strike on a fully loaded supertanker, and you are looking at an environmental catastrophe that would decimate marine ecosystems for generations. It is a profound hidden cost of this geopolitical chess match.
Listening to this breakdown, it forces you to ask a deeply philosophical question. We spent the last 20 years believing that the future was digital, that power was about data, algorithms, and soft diplomacy. But this scenario strips all of that away. Are we fundamentally just primitive empires, still fighting over access to rocks, oil, and water routes? Have we actually evolved at all, or just built shinier weapons to enforce ancient rules?
That is the most haunting question of all. We like to think we have transcended the brutal calculus of the 19th century. We wrapped ourselves in the comforting illusion of globalized supply chains and international courts. But this crisis proves that civilization is incredibly fragile. Beneath the fiber optic cables and the digital economies, the world still runs on crude oil and the threat of physical violence. We have not transcended the old rules. We have merely masked them. When the mask slips, you realize that the foundation of our entire modern existence relies on who controls the cold, dark waters of the ocean.
It is a sobering realization. The paper power of a massive economy means nothing if your energy artery can be pinched shut by a destroyer 10,000 miles away. We have summarized the tactical brilliance, the economic devastation, and the shifting alliances, but the ultimate takeaway seems to be about vulnerability.
Precisely. Every nation is currently looking in the mirror, calculating their own vulnerabilities. China is realizing the terrifying limits of its military reach. Europe is realizing the cost of its diplomatic paralysis. And the United States is realizing the immense, almost frightening power of its own leverage. But leverage is a dangerous tool. Squeeze too hard, and you might break the very system you are trying to control.
And that leaves us standing on the edge of a very steep cliff. The Strait of Hormuz is functionally sealed. The shadow fleets are being hunted. The global markets are holding their breath. The chessboard has been violently flipped, and the rules are being written in real time. The only question left, the one that will determine the fate of the global economy for the next century, is what happens when the desperate players decide they have absolutely nothing left to lose.